So, hello, and welcome back yet again to recapping this wonderful book, The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. In the last chapter, Tercel and Harrier have finally arrived at the Lake of Fire, the place that they've been trying to get to, and immediately are thrust into a very bad situation because they think they're being attacked. And in reality, it's Biso Chim trying desperately to put the genie back into the bottle, so to say. I mean, or at least protect his people from the elemental spirit of darkness, Aniran, that he has summoned up. He's realized that he done messed up. And yeah, he's trying to save the Isvani, who are all gathered around him in this lush paradise garden. And that just happens to be when Tercel and Harrier and Sinarin and Shariah all come riding up to confront him. And they show up, and Harrier unfortunately has to do a few finding spells to get them all back together because Sinarin and Shariah and their Shotars, camels, have never seen a thunderstorm before, so they're freaking out. We can pretty much be sure that the other Isvani are probably also freaking out. And into this chaos, we are going to venture yet again with my recap of Chapter 4, In the End is the Beginning. So, yeah, like I said, Harrier and Tercel, Sinarin and Shariah are all together again, which is good. They've realized that they can now see what has been hidden from them by Bisochim's magic, and that is, I'm just going to call it the Fire Sprite Shrine because, again, I cannot pronounce its actual Tenchitatel or something. I'm terrible at pronunciations, so it is what it is. Anyway, they're all looking up at it, and all of a sudden Harrier's like, gotta go. And he just mounts his Shotar and starts taking off. And Tercel's like, excuse you? What? Where are you going? And then he realizes that Harrier's like, I don't know where I'm going. And Tercel realizes that Harrier was just running off. And then he stops and thinks, and he's like, no, not running off, uh, being summoned. And he wasn't frightened or angered by the summons, at least not as frightened and angry as Tercel knew that he would be if it was something dark involved. No, it's obviously the mage price for his finding spells. And yes, indeed, that's exactly what it is. And the mage price for these finding spells is that Harrier is going to be herding all of the Isvani who are around the Lake of Fire, all of their animals back, because they're all running around out in the desert, and that's kind of certain death if they run out into the Barileth, which is hot, desolate, dry, and kind of like running into an oven. Um, the first thing that Harrier finds is a kabale, which is one of the Isvani's sheepdogs. Also, if you hear, Parky has decided it is time to have a conversation in the background, and he keeps meowing. Anyway, he's herding all of their livestock, though. But the first thing he finds is a kabale who is very mud covered, and it's trying to herd a couple of goats, a shotar, and a sheep, and Harrier helps. Well, in a very Harrier fashion. Quoting, I don't believe this, Tercel heard Harrier say, to nobody in particular. Here, hey, you, dog. At the sound of Harrier's voice, the Kabale advanced, belly to the mud and growling, and Harrier's Shotar backed up. "I'm trying to do you a favor," Harrier snarled, regaining control of his mount easily. Tercel wondered when Harrier had learned to ride so well. He didn't remember, but then he didn't remember much about the last fortnight. "Harrier," said Shariah in disbelief. Her tone conveyed the unspoken question plainly. "What are we doing here?" "Hurting," said Harrier. "Hurting things, at least I am." And with that, he takes off to complete his mage price. It's maybe not the weirdest mage price ever, but I think it's right up there with Kellen's first mage price of helping a little girl get her kitten out of the tree so that he could get a key to get back into his house. Wild magic definitely seems like it can be very uncomfortable at times. And this is definitely one of those times. Harrier, and because Sinarin and Shariah don't see much other choice, so Harrier, Shariah, Sinarin all head off to start herding these various and sundry animals, with Tercel tagging along behind, and Shariah, of course, having a little bit of commentary. "I do not see why the wild magic wishes us to aid our enemies," Shariah called after Harrier, her voice wavering between anger and uncertainty. "Shariah, I don't see why the wild magic wishes me to do anything, but I still do it," Harrier shouted back. "You should go." "No," said Shariah. She shouted this. It was difficult to have any sort of conversation across the distance between two moving Shotars and over the background noise of splashing mud and bawling livestock, but they were trying. "If the wild magic wishes you to herd the beasts of those to whom Bisochim has bespelled, well, then we're just going to help you." And they do. And the next several pages is Harrier attempting to herd everything from angry goats to furious chickens to very confused hawks back towards, the green grass that he can see up ahead. Sinarin points out that the rest of the Isvani seem to be advancing, and Tercel raises his eyes and he sees Isvani on Shotars. Lots of them. Even after Ankeldar was lost, after he had known that it was the four of them alone going to the Lake of Fire, Tercel had expected the moment when they reached it to be different, to happen at night, to happen without the Isvani army riding out at them, and now it was here and they were here and he had no idea what to do. Run? Fight? They couldn't do either one. Tercel realized that if he had known exactly what this moment would be like back in the Elven City, he would have refused to bond, refused to come, told Germain and Adalia and Sandalon and whoever wanted to listen that he just couldn't do it because he wasn't good enough and he didn't know how, and it would be better for them to get someone else or no one than to send him off to fight the dark and assume that he could do anything useful. So, yeah, Tercel is, I'm not even going to say he's at his lowest point because he's got a lot going on. And with that, we switch perspectives, at least briefly, back to Bisochim, who is looking around and trying to figure out what to do. He did feel, the moment the storm had struck, Bisochim had felt Aniran's power over the Isvani break like a flawed tether of green hide. His heart had ached to hear grown men scream with terror, for none of the desert folk had known anything of their actions from the moment Aniron had stolen their wills to the moment they found themselves standing in the midst of the open space near the cliffs, far away from their tents, lashed by wind and water. But he had dared not lift the storm or even divert his concentration from it by so much as would allow him to reassure his people. For this storm he had called was an unnatural thing in a place not meant even for natural rain, and it took constant mindfulness to hold it. And so he's holding the storm and trying to figure out what to do, because there's still the lake of fire, and he's very afraid that if he stops the rain, all she's going to do is just take control of his people and toss them into the lake of fire. So he works a huge spell, and he calls up water from everywhere he can call it from, down in the deep earth, everything. Most of his fountains that are keeping the air cool around the lake of fire, and he turns the lake of fire into a lake of very hot water. And then he's ready to not rest, but kind of rest. He rubbed his eyes wearily. This day, he thought, was the culmination of a life of searching and seeking and study that had begun upon the day the 3 books had come to his hand. He really is wondering, when did he go wrong? Because he does realize that he has gone wrong, but he doesn't know when. Yes, he had yearned to gain immortality for Saravase, but even before he had first seen her, he had been goaded and tormented by the sense that the wild magic had called him to a great task, a task that he must fulfill, not only for the good of all those who walked between the sand and star, but for all those who walked in the light. To hear himself speak of the light, even in his own mind, made Bisochim cringe, yet in his heart he had always served the balance of which the light was the visible aspect given to men to follow. And even now, at this moment of dishonor and sorrow, he could not believe that his instincts had been so terribly wrong. He thought about Aniron's mockery and the fire crown's cool disdain, and his breath caught in his throat. He had been a child when the 3 books came into his hand. A child! He had gone to the wild magic, Zoomy Cat, as eagerly as a bridegroom to his bride, intent only upon serving it joyfully and with honor. Have I never served the wild magic? Have I been nothing more than the pawn of the shadow from the moment I first drew breath? How could that be? If it were true, then the wild magic had known and seen and done nothing, had granted Bisochim the 3 books, knowing what use he would make of them, and worse, let Saravase come to him, granting him the power to do all that he had done after. And yet, if it weren't, then when had he ceased to hear the silent urging that he had followed from boyhood? And when had he listened instead to the tongueless whispers of monsters? Bisochim looked back across a sea of years, and he could not say, on this day I served the gods of wild magic, and on this day after I followed and was the servant of shadow. And not knowing was like the teeth of dogs ripping his flesh. Perhaps, and oh, how bitter it was to contemplate, perhaps the balance had never been out of true at all. Even as that thought formed itself in Bisochim's mind, he longed to cast it out. how could it be right when it was the balance itself, the balance that he had believed until this very day that he served, that had tortured his senses with the knowledge of a great wrongness that must be repaired from the beginning. He had sought after that wrongness so long and so careful, testing, always testing, lest he fall into error and fault. If there were no wrongness, he had always been the pawn of demons, and the wild magic had let it be so. And if the wrongness existed, then where was his error? He had sought the source of the wrongness so long and so carefully, lest he fall into error and fault and darkness he had always tested. You see to what end your care has brought you, son of Neged? The blood of thousands is on your hands, and you have clothed darkness in robes of flesh and set it free to walk the world. Bisochim could not think of what he might do at this point. And so, yeah, Bisochim is, I mean, it really humanizes him. It gives him it gives me so much more compassion for him, because he really did think every step of the way that he was doing the right thing. And you can't condone what he did any more than you can condone what the Isvani did when they destroyed all those cities, but they were also being fooled. They were being tricked, and it makes this book so much more complicated in a good way. You have a lot of moral gray area, and I think that's why I like this series. Anyway, getting back to it, we are back with Tercel and Harrier, and Tercel keeps asking, where did the cliff go? Because Bisochim basically melts the cliff down and fills it with water. You know, he made the lake of fire into, like I said, a lake of really, really warm water. Harrier does not actually care. He's like, I don't know, maybe it just wasn't there. Sinarin thought that, you know, maybe it was hidden by all that fog and the storm, and nobody really knows. And Harrier doesn't really care, because there's a bunch of Isvani coming their way, and they need to figure out what the heck they're going to do. And, you know, Harrier is like, what are we going to do? Just ride up and say hello? And he is kind of thankful for the storm that hit, though. On any day but today, Tercel and Harrier would not have looked much like Isvani, but in the aftermath of the storm, they were covered with dun-colored clay over almost every inch of their skins, and besides, it was clear that nobody was paying much attention to anything besides rounding up the animals. So, because of Bisochim's reign, they might have a chance to at least slip in. Harrier's thinking they'll just slip in, figure out how they're going to, I mean, let's not put too fine a point on it. Harrier just wants to go in, kill Bisochim, and then attempt to get out. He doesn't actually think it's going to be that easy, but that's kind of the only plan he's got. Shariah has no idea what's going on, and Harrier and Tercel are just flummoxed. What are we going to do when we get there? Tercel asked. Harrier stared at him incredulously. Apparently, Tercel, as usual, cared less about self-preservation than he did about getting questions answered. I was thinking you'd defeat the dark and we'd all go home, he told him shortly. It seemed like a lifetime ago. that Harrier had amused himself by teasing Tercel to produce precisely that expression on his face. This time the joke hadn't been quite so light-hearted. Tercel was the champion of light. He was the one that was supposed to have a plan once they got here. But the gaping, open-mouthed look of utter astonishment was still one that Harrier might have gotten in response to a comment at any time in the last decade. You still got a few minutes before you have to come up with a plan. Oh, said Tercel. Shariah and Sinarin are absolutely, they are showing their disapproval for this lighthearted joking and trying to basically sneak in. I don't know how they thought they were going to have anything happen, but they're doing as good as they can. The next few pages are them just kind of trying to blend in with all of the crowds of people who are just herding all of their animals back in, and it's, it's going better than they thought. And so they're approaching the edges of the encampment, and Harrier is a little stunned and a little disgusted, but not as disgusted as Shariah seems to be, because the encampment and all of the area around the Lake of Fire would not have looked out of place where Harrier and Tercel grew up. It does not look like a desert. It doesn't even look like an oasis. It looks like orchards and pastures and fields of grain, and Shariah is completely disgusted by it, and Harrier is, but he's more disgusted by it because he can tell it's out of place and it doesn't belong there, and that bothers him as a wild mage more than as a person. So they're getting in. They've made it to the edges of the encampment, and they're actually going to unsaddle their shotars and see if they can find Bisochim. They're going along, and we have several pages of that until they're finally weaving their way through the tents and everything, and suddenly, come and eat. The woman who had hailed them sat on a carpet in the open doorway of her tent, beneath the shade of an awning. Unlike the Nalzindar, or the half-dressed, mud-covered Isvani that Harrier had seen thus far, her clothing was bright and elaborate. Her chadar had a pattern of red stripes woven into the pale wool, and her long open vest was black. Her overtunic was a dark brown. It had to have been dyed, since shotar wool was a lighter color, and her undertunic beneath it was so pale that it had to have been bleached. There were 2 large water jars beside her on the carpet, and a younger woman sat beside her, tending to a kafaya brazier. She, too, was dressed brightly in a brown vest and green tunic, though her chadar matched the older woman's. Harrier remembered Shariah telling him once how the chadar was knotted and folded, told anybody who saw it the tribe you belonged to, and he wondered if it went for the coloring as well. Shariah knows this woman and is like, sorry, Umara Liafa, we aren't from your tribe, and started to move on. Liafa says, one of us is sun-touched, girl. And that brings up Shariah short, and Harrier decides that probably nobody has called her girl in quite a long time, if ever. The woman, Liafa, tells them to come in again and sit. And they don't have a whole lot more choice. And Tercell's like, maybe they know where Bisochim is? I mean, I don't know. And they go in and they sit down with Leofa, who Harrier and Tercel both notice is probably the oldest Isvani person that they've ever seen. But thankfully, they at least know how to sit and how to do things, so they think that at least for now, as long as their tunics are completely up and their burnouses are all around their faces, that maybe they can pull it off. Although how they're going to eat and drink, Harrier is not sure. After the cafea was ready, the younger woman pours and leaves, and Leofa turns to her guests and says, "Did you think I would not recognize you, Shariah?" Leofa said as soon as Remerta was gone. "Only the Nalzindar do not know that the time of the breaking of the tribes has come, and you have much the look of Ganima about you." Harrier saw Sinarin raise her head abruptly, her mouth opening as if she wanted to argue, but it was Sharia who spoke. "Ganima went to lay her bones upon the sand before my eyes first opened upon the day," said Shariah sharply. "The Nalzindar looked to no tents but their own." Leofa nodded, as if Shariah had said just what she had expected. "That has always been the way of those who journey between sand and star, and so I thought it would always be. Ganima was always my favorite, you know. Indeed, it might have been that it was she who led my tribe after me instead of Hayden. But she would have what she would have. I see she has passed that willfulness on to her daughter." "I serve," said Shariah. "Do you? What do you serve?" said Leofa. "I shall tell you what I do not serve, Leofa. I do not serve the shadow as Ikulis, as the Isvani did when they went forth at Bisochim's order to destroy the string of pearls." Leofa lets them know that no, they were not just destroying it on Bisochim's order. Bisochim didn't order them to destroy any of the cities. They found the bones of a wild mage and decided that Bisochim was right, and they were definitely going to go and fight against the false balance, and that's where Harrier loses it. Harrier says, "There's only one balance." Harrier hadn't really meant to say anything. He had meant to use his common sense and stay quiet and hope that Shariah and maybe Sinarin could figure out something to say that would get them out of here, but enough was enough. There were limits to common sense. "I don't care what you think. I don't care what Bisochim's told you or why. There's only one balance, and it isn't false, and it isn't true. It just is. And if the wild mage that Xanatar found was murdered, then he was murdered by Bisochim, because Bisochim's the only one I know of that would use his power that way. And he's been killing my friends for over a year now, and I'm really tired of it." And then Harrier gets up, takes off his chadar, takes off his burnous around his face, and is like, "All right, I'm here. Where's this Bisochim? Because, we got business with him." Tercel, on the other hand, "Don't listen to him," Tercel said to Leofa, getting to his feet and flinging off his cloak as well. "I'm the one who was sent here. The elves sent me. The light told me to come." "Did it?" said Leofa. "Shut up, Tercel," Harrier said. "Don't you listen to him, noble lady. He's sun-touched. He follows me everywhere. I can't get rid of him." You're lying," said Tercel. "He's lying. Sinner and Shariah, tell her he's lying." There is now Huge commotion everywhere because hearing the shouting, other Isvani come in and see Harrier and Tercel, recognize that they are definitely not Isvani, and start yelling. In fact, even worse, Xanatar, the leader of the Isvani who attacked all of the cities, comes running in and he's freaking out. Leofa's second in command, Hayden, comes in and grabs his sword. And Leofa calmly sits there, looks around, and is like, chill. Well, she doesn't exactly say chill. She just says people's names, but they calm down. For a few minutes anyway. Until Hayden starts yelling that the Nelzindar are fools. Shariah starts yelling that all of the Isvani who aren't Nelzindar are shadow touched, and more chaos ensues. And Harrier's thinking, why did I open my mouth? This is not cool at all. There are people yelling, more people are coming, and they have no idea what to do. Xanatar is yelling that Harrier and Tercel are demons, and finally he yells, the Nalzindar have sheltered the demons. No wonder we couldn't find them. And Leofa says, Hayden, you tempt me to live forever. My only consolation is that if there are no more tribes, then there will be no more leaders either. It will comfort me when I go lay my bones upon the sand. But for now, I shall bring these so-called demons to Bisochim, and we will seek his counsel. For should their dragon seek to aid them, then surely his dragon will succor him in turn. And she turns, and that's pretty much where the chapter ends. She's like, all right, I'm the oldest person around here. We are taking these two supposedly demons off to Bisochim, which is kind of where they wanted to go anyway. And she and Shariah and Harrier and Tercel and pretty much this giant crowd of Isvani all leave her tent and head off to who knows where, hopefully to Bisochim, who is probably in the middle of his own little mental crisis right now, because I can't even imagine what kind of disillusionment you would feel if you realize that what you thought was right and good actually turns out to be the complete opposite. But that is that chapter. It's a pretty good one. It has a lot of humor in it, but like so much else in this book, the humor sometimes is almost dark humor. Like the fact that Harrier and Tercel can find a way to bicker and argue, and still on the third book, when things are getting really, really real, still kind of make me feel like they're in a buddy cop movie, is, I think, another thing that I really like about this series. It does kind of remind me, and I don't remember if this was my thought or if this was Hazel's thought, but I know Hazel was the one that was like buddy cop movie, and I still kind of think of it more as Sam and Dean from Supernatural. Just Sam and Dean with a lot different kinds of magic, but just the way they bicker, they argue. Tercel right now is probably having another one of his biggest crises, in that he is sure that Harrier lied to him about something, but he doesn't know what. And he's right. Harrier did lie to him, and that will come up later, and it will stay a sore spot for a while. Also, I didn't catch it. It is said much more plainly later, but Shariah is actually Leofa's granddaughter. So I think that is another reason why Leofa is a good character and one that I really, really like moving forward. I like Shariah too. She's very stoic. She's very, I think, stoic. We'll just leave it with stoic. She is a good character though. I like pretty much everybody in this book. And like I said, even Bisochim, like I don't like him, but I also can't hate him. And that could prove to be a problem because in some ways I think that Harrier and Tercel are going to run into that same problem. Anyway, thank you for listening to me ramble, and I will see you next time.